When we look at the majestic castles that have survived from the Middle Ages, we see symbols of power, wealth, and stability. Their high walls, massive towers, and deep moats inspire awe and wonder. But behind these stone facades lies a history of incredible labor, logistical nightmares, and human suffering. Building a castle was not just an architectural project. It was an epic battle against nature, time, and limited resources. It was a brutal, grueling process that required tremendous organization, incredible perseverance, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for a single goal. Watch this video to the end to find out how the architects and engineers of that time were able to overcome all these difficulties and create masterpieces that still amaze us today. Imagine that you're a powerful feudal lord who has decided to build a castle. The first thing you face is a shortage of skilled workers. Unlike modern construction projects, where you can hire specialized teams, in the Middle Ages you had to rely on a limited number of craftsmen. Anyone with even a little knowledge of construction was worth their weight in gold. For example, experienced stonemasons were among the highest paid workers. They had to be able to not only cut stones into the right shape, but also read complex drawings and plans. Their work was incredibly hard and required years of training. The construction of a castle, even a small one, could take several decades, and sometimes more than a century. Work progressed slowly, and progress was barely noticeable. Entire generations of workers devoted their lives to a single project. Their efforts were aimed at leaving behind something monumental and eternal. The shortage of workers was one of the key problems. Craftsmen such as stonecutters, carpenters, blacksmiths, and bricklayers often moved from one feudal lord to another, following the most lucrative offers. Their work was highly valued, and there was real competition for them. To attract and retain such specialists, feudal lords had to offer them not only high wages, but also the best living conditions, which was very rare at that time. At the same time, thousands of unskilled workers worked alongside the craftsmen, performing the heaviest and most exhausting work. They carried stones, mixed clay and lime, dug ditches, and moved huge amounts of earth. Their labor was not highly valued, and their living conditions were much worse. But without them, construction would have been simply impossible. Organizing labor on such a huge construction site was incredibly difficult. The working day began at dawn and ended at sunset. There were no days off or vacations, and breaks were extremely rare. The entire process was subject to a strict order established by the master builders. They made sure that every stone was laid correctly and that every mortar was of the right consistency. Quality control was manual and required incredible attention to detail. Any mistake at an early stage of construction could lead to serious problems in the future, even the collapse of entire sections of the wall. It is also worth mentioning that there were no modern safety measures. Construction was carried out at great heights without safety harnesses or protective nets. Workers balanced on narrow wooden beams, lifting heavy loads with primitive winches. One wrong move could have been fatal. And all this took place in conditions where any careless step could have caused stones or tools to fall on the heads of those working below. The construction process was also heavily dependent on weather conditions. In rainy weather, work practically stopped, as the soil became sticky and the stones slippery. In winter, when temperatures dropped below zero, the mortar froze, making it impossible to lay bricks. Therefore, the construction season was limited, which further slowed down the process. These were constant challenges that had to be faced. Builders could not simply press pause and wait for favorable conditions. They had to constantly adapt, using all their experience and ingenuity. Entire generations of workers dedicated their lives to a single project. Their efforts were focused on leaving behind something monumental and eternal. Now imagine that you are one of those craftsmen. Write in the comments what part of the castle you would prefer to work on. Working with stone, building walls, or devising new defense mechanisms. The construction of the castle required enormous amounts of building materials. Stones, wood, lime, sand. All of this had to be delivered to the construction site, often from very long distances. The main building material was, of course, stone. It was quarried in quarries that could be located dozens of kilometers from the construction site. Transporting huge stone blocks was a real problem. Oxen and horses were used to pull heavy carts along dirt roads that turned into impassable mud during the rains. Special temporary roads were often built to facilitate the process, which also required a large number of workers. But even these roads did not save them from broken wheels, broken axles, and constant delays caused by bad weather. Loads could get stuck for days or even weeks, disrupting the entire construction schedule. Wood was also vital, but its extraction was no less difficult. Loggers felled trees which were then floated down rivers or transported by land. The wood was used to build scaffolding, temporary structures, and beams for floors. The strength and durability of the entire structure depended on the selection and preparation of the wood. For example, the strongest trees were chosen for beams, and those that were easy to work with were chosen for scaffolding. Entire teams worked in the forests, not only felling trees but also processing them on site to reduce their weight and volume for transport. In addition to stone and wood, huge amounts of lime, sand, and water were required. Water was needed to prepare mortar, and it often had to be carried by hand from nearby sources. Every bucket, every bag, all of it was delivered to the construction site with enormous effort. Organizing this process was a real logistical nightmare. The feudal lords who built the castles had to not only provide workers, but also ensure the uninterrupted supply of all necessary materials. They often used compulsory corvée labor, recruiting peasants from their estates to help with transportation. This caused discontent as it distracted people from their fieldwork. To build a single castle, entire forests had to be cut down, leading to serious changes in the landscape. These were real environmental disasters, but in those days, no one thought about such things. Castles were built as symbols of power and protection, and their construction was a priority that justified any expense, including the destruction of the surrounding environment. Now think about which part of the logistical process was the most difficult: quarrying stone or transporting wood. And do you know what that tells us? It tells us that even the most ambitious goals consist of thousands of small, invisible steps. Watch the video to the end to find out what else made building a castle so difficult. Medieval architects were true geniuses. They created incredibly complex and stable structures without modern tools or calculations. Castle walls, for example, were built taking into account not only their thickness, but also their angle of inclination to reflect the blows of siege weapons. The construction of a castle began with the foundation. The foundation had to be not only deep, but also very strong. It was poured with a mixture of lime, sand, and water to create a monolithic base. Only then did they begin to erect the walls. The quality of the foundation was critically important. Any mistake at this stage could lead to cracks in the walls and subsequent collapse. Therefore, architects carefully chose the site for construction, giving preference to rocky foundations that provided natural strength. If there were no rocks, they dug deep trenches and filled them with a mixture of stones and lime mortar, creating an artificial monolith capable of supporting the weight of multi-ton walls. Each stone was cut by hand to fit perfectly with the one next to it. This took not only skill, but also incredible precision. The stonemasons used different tools like chisels, hammers, and squares to make smooth surfaces and perfect angles. Many of these craftsmen were true artists, capable of transforming rough stone into part of a magnificent mosaic. They worked without modern blueprints, relying on their knowledge, experience, and intuition. Castle plans were often very simple, with all the details being worked out on site. This required constant interaction between the architect and the workers, as well as the ability to quickly solve problems as they arose. Particular attention was paid to the construction of towers. They were not just a decorative element, but a key part of the defensive system. Towers were made round or polygonal so that they could better withstand the impact of siege weapons. Round towers, for example, had no corners that would be vulnerable to battering rams and projectiles. Inside the towers, there were often spiral staircases that allowed quick movement between floors, as well as loopholes from which defenders could fire. One of the most unique elements of the castle was the donjon, or main tower. It served not only as living quarters, but also as a last refuge in case of siege. The keep was the most complex and expensive element of the castle, and its construction could take years. It was always built on the most protected site, had the thickest walls and a minimum number of entrances and windows, which made it virtually impregnable. The upper floors of the donjon housed the feudal lord's living quarters, while the lower floors contained food stores and wells, which allowed the castle to withstand a long siege. The construction of the walls was an art in itself. They consisted of 2 layers, an outer and inner stone masonry, with the space between them filled with a mixture of fine gravel and lime mortar. This made the walls incredibly strong and able to withstand enormous loads. The walls could be several meters thick, making them impenetrable to any siege weapons of the time. To ensure stability and avoid displacement, the walls were built with a slight slope toward the center, which gave them additional stability. In the Middle Ages, architectural science was inextricably linked to art and craftsmanship. Master builders, known as master architects, passed their knowledge down from generation to generation, supplementing it with their own experience and observations. It was not just a job, but a true calling that required a deep understanding of materials, physics, and geometry. They did not have access to complex formulas and computing machines, so all calculations were made intuitively, based on years of practice. For them, every arch, every vault, and every wall was a living organism that had to be balanced and harmonious. This is why medieval structures such as Gothic cathedrals still amaze us with their elegance and lightness. Despite the enormous weight of the stone, these buildings seem weightless because architects skillfully use buttresses and flying buttresses to redistribute weight and relieve pressure on the walls. To ensure the stability of buildings, master architects developed unique solutions, such as the use of wooden scaffolding and lifting mechanisms. The construction of high walls and towers would have been impossible without complex scaffolding systems, which were erected from sturdy logs fastened with ropes and wooden pegs. These structures allowed workers to safely climb to the required height and also served as supports for the walls under construction. Lifting mechanisms, powered by humans or animals, consisted of winches, blocks, and levers, which were used to lift heavy stone blocks upward. Some of these mechanisms were so complex that their drawings, which have survived to this day, are astonishing in their engineering ingenuity. Every stage of the work, from quarrying the stone to installing it in the wall, was carefully planned to ensure maximum efficiency and safety. Despite the lack of precise calculations, medieval architects skillfully applied the principles of physics and geometry. They intuitively understood how loads are distributed and how to create a strong and stable structure using a minimum amount of material. For example, when building arched vaults, they knew that the shape of the arch allowed the weight to be transferred from the center to the side supports. This made it possible to create huge spans without having to use walls that were too thick, which made buildings lighter and more elegant. To ensure perfect symmetry and proportions, architects used the so-called golden triangle and other geometric principles that helped them achieve harmony in their creations. These principles were based on observations of nature, where all shapes and proportions strive for perfect balance. Particular attention was paid to the selection and processing of building materials. In addition to stone, wood, lime, sand, and clay were widely used. Wood was used for scaffolding, roofs, and internal floors, as well as for creating temporary structures that supported arches and vaults until the mortar had completely set. The lime mortar used to bind the stones was not just cement, but a complex mixture to which egg whites, animal fat, or even blood could be added to increase its strength and water resistance. Masons were able to determine the quality of stone by touch, selecting only those blocks that were strong enough and had no internal cracks. Stone processing was an incredibly laborious process, requiring enormous patience and precision, as each stone had to fit perfectly into the overall picture. As a result, medieval architectural science was a unique combination of craftsmanship, intuition, and a deep understanding of the nature of materials. It was a time when an architect was not just an engineer, but an artist and philosopher rolled into one. His work was inextricably linked to the spiritual world, and each building was a reflection of his worldview. They did not simply build walls and towers, but created living spaces that were meant to serve people and stand the test of time. Their legacy is not just ruins and ancient buildings, but a whole layer of knowledge that still inspires modern architects and engineers. It is thanks to these geniuses that we can admire incredible structures that seem to defy the laws of physics, but are in fact their perfect embodiment. Medieval architects were not afraid to experiment. They were constantly looking for new methods and materials to improve their creations. It was a continuous learning process that was passed down from master to apprentice, and each new project was an opportunity for them to expand the boundaries of their knowledge. They learned from their mistakes and from the successes of their predecessors, creating unique and inimitable structures that reflected the spirit of their time. Without scaffolding, it would have been impossible to build the high walls of the castle. The scaffolding was made of wood and attached directly to the walls. It was very dangerous and labor-intensive work. The scaffolding consisted of vertical posts and horizontal beams that were connected to each other. Workers climbed these scaffolds, carrying heavy stones and tools. The height of the scaffolding could reach several dozen meters, and every step was a risk. There were no safety ropes or nets during the construction of castles. One wrong move could lead to disaster. Workers had to constantly balance on narrow beams, while wind and bad weather made their work even more dangerous. In addition, the scaffolding itself was very fragile and not always reliable. The wood used to build it was not always of the best quality, and the joints were not very strong. Workers constantly risked their lives climbing to great heights, where the slightest mistake could cause them to fall. The construction of the castle required not only strength, but also dexterity. The workers did not just climb the scaffolding, they also carried heavy loads, stones, sacks of lime, buckets of water. Lifting each load was a separate task that required the coordinated actions of the entire team. To make lifting easier, they used primitive systems of blocks and winches, but even these did not remove all the load. As the walls grew taller, the scaffolding had to be constantly extended. This was difficult and dangerous work that required special skills from the carpenters. They had to not only add new beams, but also ensure that the entire structure remained stable. Any miscalculation or poor fastening could cause the scaffolding to collapse, resulting in tragedy. The workers spent most of their day on the scaffolding. They ate lunch right there without going down to save precious time. They continued their work in all weather conditions, whether it was scorching sun or piercing wind. Rain made the beams slippery, and gusts of wind threatened to knock them down. These people were true heroes who, without any protection, created magnificent structures that still amaze our imagination today. Imagine having to work at such a height without any safety equipment. Would you take the risk? Watch the video to the end to find out what else made this process so incredibly difficult. The construction of the castle required thousands of workers. These were not only skilled craftsmen, but also ordinary laborers who did the heaviest and dirtiest work. They carried stones, mixed mortar, and lifted materials to the top. The workers lived in very harsh conditions. They were often housed in temporary barracks built right on the construction site. Living conditions were primitive, with no amenities. The workers were constantly at risk. There were no safety regulations on the construction sites. Falls from heights, collapsing structures, accidents with tools and machinery were all part of everyday life. Many workers suffered serious injuries that could lead to disability or even death. The lack of medical care on site made any injury potentially fatal. If someone suffered a fracture or serious wound, they had to rely on themselves or their loved ones for help, which in most cases was ineffective. Death on construction sites was not uncommon, but no one kept track of the dead, and their names were forgotten as quickly as their lives. The division of labor on the construction site was clearly organized. In addition to bricklayers and their apprentices, who were the most respected group, carpenters, blacksmiths, diggers, and other specialists worked on the construction site. Bricklayers were responsible for processing and laying stones, creating complex elements such as arches, vaults, and loopholes. Carpenters built scaffolding, lifting mechanisms, and formwork for the arches. Blacksmiths forged the tools and metal parts needed for construction, as well as making grills and gates. Diggers dug foundations and trenches and prepared the construction site. Each group of workers had its own professional secrets and traditions that were passed down from generation to generation. Despite the harsh conditions, workers created their own professional communities. These communities, often called guilds, played an important role in their lives. Guilds provided mutual support, helping members in trouble and protecting their interests before the feudal lords. They also regulated the quality of work and trained young craftsmen, passing on their accumulated knowledge. Membership in a guild gave workers a certain status and protection, which was extremely important in a feudal society. However, not all workers could afford to join a guild, and most of them remained outside this system, completely defenseless against arbitrary rule. An important element of construction was the organization of food and accommodation. Feeding thousands of workers was a complex logistical task. Food was prepared in large cauldrons and consisted mainly of simple and nutritious dishes such as porridge, bread, and legumes. Meat was a rarity and was mainly reserved for craftsmen and supervisors. Workers were often allowed to hunt in the surrounding forest to add some variety to their diet. Accommodation was no better. Temporary barracks were cramped and poorly heated, making them virtually uninhabitable during the cold season. Many slept on straw, wrapped in old blankets. Their labor was part of a monumental process that united thousands of destinies. Despite the anonymity and hardship of their work, they were true heroes of their time. Behind every stone that was cut and every wall that was raised stood incredible endurance and determination. The construction of the castle was a collective effort where every worker, from the simplest laborer to the master builder, contributed. It was work that required not only physical strength, but also mental fortitude. And although the names of these people have been forgotten, their legacy remains in stone, reminding us of those who created great architectural masterpieces with their sweat and blood. Lime was one of the key building materials. It was used to prepare the mortar that held the stones together, but obtaining it was not easy. Lime was obtained by burning limestone in special kilns called lime kilns. This process required a huge amount of firewood and constant temperature control. If the temperature was too low, the limestone would not burn, and if it was too high, it could melt and become unusable. The firing process required huge amounts of wood, which often led to the clearing of entire forests around the construction site. Workers had to constantly monitor the fire, adding wood to maintain the required temperature for several days. It was difficult and laborious work that required not only physical strength, but also knowledge. The workers who operated the furnaces worked in extremely hot and dusty conditions. Their work was exhausting, and the smoke from the furnaces made the air unbearable. Constant contact with dust and smoke could lead to serious health problems. However, these people had no choice. They did their work knowing that without it, the castle could not be built. After the limestone was burned, it became quicklime. This material was very caustic and had to be handled with extreme caution. It was then slaked by adding water to produce slaked lime, which was suitable for making mortar. The process of slaking lime was also very dangerous. When water was added, the quicklime began to heat up significantly, releasing steam. This could cause burns if care was not taken. After slaking, the lime was mixed with sand and water to obtain a mortar. This process was called mixing. The mortar was made by hand using shovels and other tools. It was very hard and dirty work that required enormous physical effort from the workers. They had to mix tons of mortar to ensure the smooth work of the masons who laid the stones on the walls. Lime mortar not only bonded the stones together, but also served as a waterproofing agent. It prevented moisture from penetrating the walls, protecting them from destruction. The strength and durability of the entire structure depended on the quality of the mortar. Therefore, the master builders carefully monitored the preparation process to avoid mistakes. Anyone who mixed the mortar incorrectly could be punished. The workers who operated the kilns worked in very hot and dusty conditions. Their work was exhausting, and the smoke from the kilns made the air unbearable. But without lime, the construction of the castle would have been impossible. But what if all these difficulties were just a prelude to even greater ones? Imagine that you have boiled this lime and now you have to carry it. This is where temporary structures come to the rescue. Watch the video to the end to find out what these magical structures are. The construction of the castle required the creation of many temporary structures to facilitate the work. These were not only scaffolding, but also lifting mechanisms. Winches were used to lift heavy stones to the top. They were made of wood and were operated manually or with the help of horses. Such mechanisms were very primitive, but they allowed huge stones to be lifted to the required height. The winches consisted of a large drum around which a rope was wound. Workers turned a handle, or, in larger versions, horses walked in a circle, setting the mechanism in motion. It was exhausting work that required enormous physical strength and endurance. Each lift was slow and tense, and the slightest mistake could cause the load to fall. Temporary ramps were also used for construction, along which workers lifted stones on carts. These ramps were made of earth and stones and formed a complex system that was constantly rebuilt as the walls grew. The ramps were built at a certain angle so that workers and animals could easily lift heavy loads up them. As the walls grew taller, the ramps were lengthened and extended, becoming increasingly complex. This required constant monitoring and calculation to ensure that the ramps did not collapse under the weight of the load and people. In addition to winches and ramps, rollers and levers were used to move stones. With their help, huge boulders could be moved short distances. Levers were especially useful for positioning stones on the wall. An experienced worker could move a stone weighing several hundred kilograms with a single lever. It was an art that required precision and knowledge of physics, although at that time these laws were only known on an intuitive level. Wooden frames were used to build arches and vaults. These temporary structures, called formwork, supported the stones until the mortar set. After that, the frame was removed and the arch stood on its own. The construction of such frames required incredible skill from the carpenters. They had to create a perfectly flat and sturdy structure that could support the weight of the stones and the workers. Mistakes in this process could lead to the collapse of the entire arch. All these temporary structures were an integral part of the construction process. They required a huge amount of wood and constant maintenance, but without them, it would have been impossible to build a single castle. These structures are the invisible heroes of construction, allowing the architectural masterpieces we see today to be created. They are a testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of medieval builders who, using the simplest of tools, created truly great things. Every element of a castle, whether a wall, tower, or gate, had not only aesthetic but also defensive significance. The walls were thick to withstand the impact of battering rams and siege engines. Towers were built at the corners to provide circular protection. The gates were the most vulnerable part of the castle, so they were made as strong as possible. They consisted of several layers, including a drawbridge, a grate, and massive wooden doors. Above the gates were loopholes from which attackers could be fired upon. In addition to this, so-called machicolations were often used, protruding embrasures through which stones and other objects could be thrown directly onto the heads of enemies trying to break down the gates. This made the approach to the gates incredibly dangerous. Even the smallest details, such as the battlements on the walls, had a defensive purpose. They provided cover for the defenders, allowing them to shoot at their enemies while remaining relatively safe. Every decision in the castle's design was dictated by military necessity. The walls were not just thick, they often had a sloping base, which caused projectiles from siege engines to bounce off rather than pierce the wall. The construction of corner towers was also a very important element. They allowed defenders to fire at enemies at the foot of the walls. If the towers had been square, they would have had dead zones that could not be shot through. Round towers, on the other hand, provided a complete circular view and firepower. In some castles, the towers were built in several stages. The lower levels were made thicker than the upper ones, which gave the structure additional stability. In addition to the main walls and towers, castles were often surrounded by barbicans, additional fortifications that protected the gates. These were small forts located in front of the main gates and had their own walls, towers, and drawbridges. The purpose of the barbican was to delay the enemy and force them to attack in several stages, giving the defenders extra time to prepare. Also, shooting galleries were used to protect the castle. These were narrow passages inside the walls that let archers and crossbowmen move around and shoot while staying hidden from the enemy. These galleries were part of a complex defense system that made the castle virtually impregnable. Every detail, every element of the castle had a purpose. Castles were not just places of residence, but complex military machines created for one purpose: to withstand any attack. A castle was not just a fortress, it was the center of a feudal estate. Its construction stimulated the development of infrastructure around it. Roads were built, quarries were developed, and workshops were created. The workers who built the castle needed food, clothing, and housing. This led to the growth of villages and towns around the construction site. Craftsmen appeared who supplied the builders with everything they needed. The construction of a castle, which could last for decades, turned temporary settlements into permanent ones. For example, blacksmith shops often sprang up around castles, where tools for stonemasons and carpenters were made, as well as workshops where building materials were produced. taverns and bakeries appeared, providing food for thousands of workers, as well as shops where clothes and other goods could be bought. Thus, the construction of a castle was not only an architectural project, but also a catalyst for economic growth. It created jobs and stimulated trade, leading to the prosperity of the entire region. The feudal lord who built the castle invested huge sums of money, which were distributed among the local population. It was a kind of government contract that supported the region's economy. To provide the castle with everything it needed, feudal lords created entire farms. These were not only agricultural lands, but also fishing ponds, orchards, and vegetable gardens, which were located inside the castle or in its immediate vicinity. This ensured food security in case of a siege. The castles also had wells that provided access to water, which was vital. The castle itself was a complex system that included not only living quarters and defensive structures, but also many other buildings that ensured its functioning. These were kitchens, warehouses, stables, workshops, and even chapels. Each building had its own function and required constant maintenance. The construction of a castle was also a symbol of power and prestige. The larger and more magnificent the castle, the stronger and richer its owner was considered to be. The castle was the center of feudal rule, where all important decisions were made, courts were held, and taxes were collected. It was not just a home for the feudal lord, but the focal point of all his power. The development of infrastructure around the castle also had social significance. People who came to work on the construction site brought with them new ideas and skills. This contributed to the exchange of knowledge and the development of crafts. A new society formed around the castle, which was more dynamic and developed than traditional rural communities. Thus, the construction of the castle was not only an architectural project, but also a catalyst for economic and social growth. It created jobs and stimulated trade, leading to the prosperity of the entire region. Castles were not just fortresses, but living organisms that shaped the landscape and life around them. Building a castle was an incredibly expensive undertaking. Its financing required enormous funds, which feudal lords obtained from their estates. These were taxes, levies, and income from agriculture. Building a castle was not only a physical challenge, but also a financial one. The feudal lord had to raise enormous sums of money, which were not so easily available in those days. The main source of income was taxes collected from the peasants. Often these were not only money, but also natural products such as grain, livestock, and wood. All of this was used to support the builders. Feudal lords could also introduce additional taxes or even resort to forced labor, when peasants were required to work on construction without pay. This caused discontent and could lead to riots, but the thirst for power and prestige was stronger. Feudal lords were often forced to borrow money from moneylenders or even sell part of their land to complete construction. A castle was a symbol of status, and its construction was a matter of honor. Leaving a project unfinished meant losing authority and showing weakness. Therefore, many feudal lords took enormous risks to see their projects through to completion. They mortgaged their lands, took out huge loans, and gave up part of their wealth to build a magnificent fortress. Some castles were never completed due to lack of funds. Their ruins still remind us of the financial difficulties faced by their owners. These were real economic risks that could have led to ruin. Today, we only see the castles that were successfully completed, but history remembers those who failed. The ruins of unfinished castles are monuments to financial instability and ambitions that were not backed by resources. In addition to the direct costs of materials and labor, there were other expenses. The feudal lord had to pay for transportation, tools, and food for the workers. All this required a constant flow of funds, which had to be uninterrupted. Any delay in financing could halt construction for months or even years. The construction of a castle was also a tool of political influence. With the help of a castle, a feudal lord could strengthen his power, control trade routes, and defend his possessions. A castle was not only a fortress, but also a center for collecting taxes and a symbol of power that forced neighbors and vassals to respect its owner. Thus, construction costs were an investment in the political future. Sometimes, to finance construction, feudal lords formed alliances with wealthy merchants or even the church. These alliances gave them access to the necessary funds, but in return, the feudal lords had to make concessions, giving up part of their lands, or granting trade privileges. It was a complex and risky financial dance that required not only strength, but also intelligence on the part of the feudal lord. The construction of a medieval castle was a truly monumental project that required enormous effort and resources. It was not just a construction project, but a real test for everyone involved. But the result was worth it. Many of these castles still stand today, reminding us of the greatness and perseverance of our ancestors. Which medieval castle do you think is the most impressive in terms of architecture and scale? Write about it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.